Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where in the world you happen to be located. Welcome to the webinar entitled Brazil, Europe, United States - New Horizons, organized in partnership between the Europe and the United States nucleus of CEBRI, and brought to you jointly by CEBRI and the US Embassy and Consulates in Brazil. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Ronaldo Veirano, and together with Demetrio Magnoli, I am a coordinator of the Europe nucleus of CEBRI. We are extremely pleased to welcome and extend our sincere thanks to our panelists for having graciously accepted our invitation to join us in today's webinar. Ambassador Thomas Shannon, Senior Counsel for International Affairs of the United States law firm Arnold & Porter, former Deputy Secretary of State for Political Affairs of the Department of State of the United States of America, and former Ambassador of the United States to Brazil, where he has many friends and admirers. Dr. Gunther Mayhold, Deputy Director of the German Institute of International and Security Affairs, and last but not least, Ambassador Sergio Amaral, member of the board of CEBRI and coordinator of the United States nucleus of CEBRI, former Minister of Development, Industry and Commerce of Brazil between 2016 and 2019, and former Ambassador of Brazil to the United Kingdom, France, and the United States. Our distinguished panelists will address the present political and economic situation in the United States, Europe, and the mood vis-a-vis the current change which has occurred in Brazil with the election of a new president. Hopefully, there will be significant changes for the better in the diplomatic relations between Brazil and the United States, as well as between Brazil and Europe, which hopefully will bring about greater cooperation and collaboration among the countries in that part of the world to the benefit of all concerned. The moderator of our panel today will be Professor Ana Paula Tostes, Senior Fellow of CEBRI, to whom, without further ado, I now turn the floor over. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Ronaldo, for the introduction of our webinar. This is a happy morning. We are very lucky to have distinguished guests with us today, and I'm sure that will be a great webinar because we are in a new international scenario, an important moment to have a discussion about the issue of this webinar, the relationship between Brazil, United States, and Europe for the future. And at the present, we have fresh news and events in all the three countries and regions rights that we will talk about. So there's a lot to talk. In the US, there was the midterm elections with consequences for the Biden administration and the strength of the Democrats. In Europe, we see the winter approaching and the war in Ukraine taking too long to finish. And in Brazil, we do have a new elected president. So Brazilians are very interested in debating about the new foreign policy perspectives. Last week we had the first major appearance of Lula as the new elected president of Brazil at the climate conference of United Nations, the COP27, and that was Lula addressed a speech that made any surprise to us. So Lula made a statement following all our expectations. Lula said, "Brazil is back in the world." right? So also he said clearly how much his foreign policy will return to the climate agenda. So in order to discuss many topics, and in particular the scenarios of Brazil and Brazilian foreign policy and opportunities in relations, in international relations and in relation to Brazil's historic Western partnerships with the United States and Europe, we are delighted to welcome perfect guests today to have a rich conversation. So this should be our last Europe program webinar in the year 2022. And this was organized jointly with the United States program of CEBRI, as Ronaldo just said. So I'm very happy. We are closing the year in a very high level discussion. Thank you, everyone. So I have to jump to our panel. And I'm going to explain very quickly the rule of our webinar. Our guests will have about 15 to 20 minutes to talk. Then I will make a very short comment and address a question or comments, whatever Demetrio Magnoli, that's with us here, would like to address. And then I will invite, of course, the audience and all people that are following us, send questions by the Q&A Zoom platform and YouTube. So we will have one first round with my comments and Demetrio and a second, and so the speakers can react to each other talks, so we can have a second round. I hope I can manage that. So after the debate, if we still have time, it would be perfect to have at least 3 minutes, 5 minutes for each speakers to address final remarks, and Ronaldo can close the webinar. So that's it. Thank you so much. I talked too much as I do. So let's start. Honored speakers, I'd like to thank you again for accepting, sharing this virtual table with us. It's a real privilege. So Ambassador Channel, please, I give you the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Ana Paula, and it's a tremendous pleasure to be here with all of you today. I've been looking forward to this discussion because in many ways, I think it's going to shape how the European Union, the United States, and Brazil understand the 21st century and understand how great democracies and great economies relate to each other in a complicated world, a world of great power competition, a world that many people think will be defined by conflict and contestation between the United States and China, but also will involve a larger world and a larger universe. And it's a tremendous pleasure to be here with Gunther and Sergio, and of course with Demetrio and Ronaldo, who bring a kind of enormous experience and understanding and vision. And I'm looking forward to the discussion because I think in many ways, at least from my point of view, I stand to learn a lot from this conversation. But let me start by just saying a few things. First of all, Ana Paula, you noted the happiness with which President Lula was received at the COP meetings. And his statement that Brazil is back in many ways mirrors President Biden's statement after his election. And the point is, of course, that both the United States and Brazil have built an active global presence, but a global presence that receded during 2 presidencies. In the United States, the presidency of Donald Trump, and in Brazil during the still ongoing presidency of Jair Bolsonaro, as both countries turned inward and both countries dealt with really significant political change and transition in both countries, while at the same time asserting an economic nationalism, which was all about focusing on the well-being and growth of national economies with little understanding of how that national growth and prosperity is linked to broader political alliances, trading relationships, investment relationships, and broadly speaking, economic understandings in which international trade and investment become important drivers of regional integration and economic growth. But there's something also important about the reaction to President-elect Lula's trip to COP27. And that is that Brazil is a great power. When we talk about great power competition, it's important to include Brazil in that conversation. But it's an unusual great power because it is a country that has achieved great power status almost entirely through soft power, through its democratic development, through its ability to show that democracy can be a socially and economically transformative political system, that you can fundamentally address poverty, inequality, and social exclusion in a peaceful way and in an orderly way that reflects constitutional government and process, but also because of a culture that's profoundly attractive and an openness in its society and the possibility for individual fulfillment that is profoundly attractive. And because of this, Brazil's absence from the global community was missed. And the fact that it is re-engaging on an issue like climate change is more than symbolic because it underscores the important role that I believe Brazil will play during the presidency of Ignacio Lula da Silva as Brazil re-engages on one of the most pressing and important issues of the 21st century. But as Brazil considers how it is going to engage and what comes next in its foreign policy, it's striking to note the similarities between the United States and Brazil. I believe in many ways the two countries mirror each other. They're huge democracies, they're continental countries, and in many ways they're both struggling with the similar kinds of problems. Significant political change and transition as new voices in the body politic look for representation. Of course, in the United States, Americans are largely stuck with two parties. Brazil has the pleasure of having many parties to choose from. But the reality is, I believe in many ways, what we've seen in Brazil over the past really decade has been a slow building but silent rebellion of a middle class, which is looking for new political voice. And for all the reasons we're familiar with, the political class, especially political parties in Brazil, fundamentally failed the Brazilian people at an important moment. And Jair Bolsonaro's emergence from the margins of political society and his ability to capture the presidency really reflected a collapse in the Brazilian people's confidence in its political parties and largely its political class. And what he has been able to accomplish during his presidency is considerable when you look at how a country which historically understood itself as center-left has really become center-right, and how a country has divided itself, not only politically, but geographically. And in this sense, Brazil does reflect what's happening in the United States, because the United States is equally divided, both politically and geographically. And this split is a huge challenge to politicians. But what's striking about voters in both countries, and if you compare the midterm elections with Brazil's elections, it's evident that a core group of voters, whether you want to call them independents or moderates, decided that whatever their views were, Republican, Democrat, center-left, center-right, that at the same time, they were done with the eccentricities. They were done with the personalization of national politics, and especially they were done with national interests and the presence of each country, Brazil and the United States, in the world, being defined by the idiosyncrasies of the personalities of leaders. And they were looking for a vision of each country that presented itself in the world in a more serious fashion and in a fashion which more closely aligned with national interests. And in this regard, I think there is a tremendous opportunity for Brazil and the United States to rebuild dialogue, rebuild cooperation and collaboration. But in this regard, this kind of work can't be done alone. And from my point of view, what's important at this point in time is the relationship between Brazil and Europe, both the European Union and the individual countries of the European Union, but also the United States and Europe. And I see a form of triangulation between North America, South America, and Europe that can play an important role in fortifying democratic practice and process and democratic institutions in all three regions, and can underscore the importance of market-based economies and trade-based growth, while at the same time noting the importance of regulatory structures, especially in a world that is emerging technologically at a very fast pace, and in which how you understand and adapt to new technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's quantum computing, whether it's the kind of advances we're going to see in the life sciences and the biosciences, really across the board, is going to require governments that can move at a faster pace, that have greater flexibility and agility, but also conceptually can articulate what this change means to the citizens of Brazil, the United States, and Europe. And while all of this is happening, these three regions, as they look for ways to coordinate and communicate with each other, have to understand the very contested environment globally that we're going to find ourselves. Now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the most dramatic example of this, but we are going to see similar events taking place around the world, especially as a whole group of regional powers begin to emerge and begin to pursue their own immediate national interests, especially in their near neighborhoods, and as they attempt to determine how the international community responds and reacts to their aggressions of one sort or another. And whether it's disputes between Turkey and Syria, disputes between Iran and Kurdistan in Iraq, whether it's disputes between India and Pakistan, whether it's disputes between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan, and any number of other places. This contested world and potentially complicated and violent world is going to require real understanding and skill and ability of engagement. But what strikes me as important about this triangular relationship between the United States, Europe, and Brazil, first of all, is the rooted nature of the relationships, the institutional structures that have been built already, and the evocation, increasingly, that these regions have for peaceful resolution of dispute. And in this regard, Brazil really stands out because it really is a country that has devoted itself to peaceful resolution of disputes for nearly 2 centuries and has done so quite skillfully. And I think in this regard, it's very important as Brazil re-engages in the world, and especially as it builds relationships between the new presidency and the leadership and governments of Europe and the United States, that it remain a voice for peace, and it remains a voice for resolution of dispute and conflict. And I think this is going to be especially important in regard to Ukraine, because it is important to highlight the fact that Russian aggression in Ukraine threatens the long-term stability and peace and prosperity of Europe. And what's happening in Central Europe could very easily happen in Central Asia also, given Russia's ambitions in Central Asia. And so how the Ukraine dispute is managed and handled is of huge importance, not just to the United States and NATO, but to all the countries of the European Union, and how we can find ways to end the fighting and try to address the food security and energy security problems that have been generated by that conflict are going to be really important. And in this regard, I believe that President Jair Bolsonaro's visit to Moscow was a big mistake, and allowed Brazil to be pulled in to a conflict and allowed its position to be questioned or put into doubt for a very transactional purpose, which is addressing fertilizers and other products necessary for Brazil's agricultural productivity. And it was a narrowness of approach that was surprising for me, but I think ultimately damaging for Brazil, and one that President Ignacio Lula da Silva, when he assumes office, is going to have to address to a certain extent. And so as we look ahead into how these great nations relate to each other, how the United States, Brazil, the countries of the European Union, and the European Union itself engage and fashion an approach to a new world, I really think we're at a point in which we really are making a new transatlantic relationship, but it's no longer a transatlantic relationship defined by the North Atlantic. It's defined by the North and the South Atlantic. And it's going to be a transatlantic relationship in which Brazil is going to play a prominent and important role. And so it's my hope that these three regions, but especially Brazil and the United States, given the kind of political turmoil that we're dealing with now, and that will continue over time, because our countries are so evenly divided, we'll be able, in the course of managing our internal political disputes, to begin to build consensus and define an understanding of the world we live in that is going to permit us to act with a degree of cooperation and collaboration that will ultimately ensure the peace. Because if the 21st century wants to be different from the 20th century, and if we want to find a way to allow the tremendous technological advances we're going to see really have an impact in the qualitative, improving the quality of life of people around the globe, we have to keep the peace. We have to find a way to end disputes. And I think in this regard, Brazil can play an important role. So thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues on the panel.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I will, give the floor now to Gunther. Gunther Mayhold, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this discussion, which is quite timely in the situation of a change of government in Brazil and situation of transformation of the international order. And this is in my presentation, the first point I like to stress. Europe is living just right now a geopolitical moment that it hasn't known for a lot of decades now. And this has generated some sort of new understanding with respect about its partnerships all around the world. In a first reaction to the crisis initiated by the invasion of Ukraine, the reaction of the Europeans with respect to the rest of the world has been join us in our position in establishing sanctions on Russia and trying to isolate Russia in the international sphere. I think one of the elements that Europe had to learn is that this reaction that it expected from its partners didn't take place in the way that was expected. We see a lot of countries which in some way are condemning the invasion, but they do not participate in the proposal to establish sanctions in the concept of isolating in some way Russia with respect to the international community. And this is an element that the Europeans in their heterogeneity are now trying to understand and try to reorient their own proposals. We have always to maintain present that the European Union, although it may try to appear as a unified actor, it has huge internal differences, and that we have seen in the last months important changes in the governments of Italy and Sweden, which are turning to the right and will make it even more difficult to generate the consensus inside of the European Union. So one element in the answer to the turnaround in the international system of Europe has been to go partnering around the world. Look how they can establish new partnerships in very different ranges. It may be political partnerships, it may be resource partnerships, it may be technological partnerships, and all these offers that have been developed in some way up to now didn't have the result that was expected. And this has to do with different perceptions. What the Europeans, in my opinion, see as a watershed movement and the beginning of a new international order for many countries in the global south doesn't appear as such. They are seeing a more situation in Europe with a European war, which is not of their incumbents, and they are looking around how they can behave in the most appropriate way in order to not be involucrated, not to be made participant of the conflicts in Europe. So the discussions that we have seen in Africa and Asia and in Latin America reflect quite well that the position which some colleagues have defined as active non-alignment is reflected in their international behavior. And that gives a lot of difficulties for Europe to really establish the partnerships it is really interested in. My second point is how has been the electoral result in Brazil received in Europe. I can say all around, maybe with some exception of Hungary, the majority of the governments were relieved in some way to come back to a relationship with Brazil, which could in some way be understood as the comeback of the Brazilian leadership of the region. Although Brazil itself never has aspired to have a regional leadership position, it has always been perceived in Europe like this. And there is a certain trap that could open for Brazil as well, because the expectations that the old Lula will come back and the activities and the diplomatic activity, the international activity will come back as we saw it in his governments, will be back in place soon, does not really see the changed conditions in Brazil, but as well the changed conditions in the international realm. First of all, I think what we have seen in the last month has been some transformation in the international organizations where we are active. Some have interpreted it as a sort of competition, even confrontation between the BRICS and the G7. And as Brazil is one of the founding members of the BRICS, it will play an important role in order to change a situation which has become in some way confrontational or could become confrontational due to the interests of Russia or of China. And therefore, I think a very large group of politicians are hoping that in the BRICS group won't appear a new confrontational way of organizing the activities, and that there should be as well in the G20, and we see in the year 2024 that Brazil will assume its G20 presidency, and new turnaround in order to look for common action, in order to look for global governance schemes, in order to change the nationalist approach that we have seen in the last years. Third point, as you can imagine, the Amazon is one of the major interests of the European actors, especially with respect to stop deforestation, to relaunch the Amazon Pact, which has been in some way been a project by Norway and Germany, to reconstruct a multilateralist relationship with Brazil, and as we have seen in the COP meeting, to have an active partner in climate policies and in order to achieve the 1.5 objective in this area. So deforestation is one issue, but as well, there are essential points concerning clean energy transitions and industry decarbonization. And these are points where I would expect that there could emerge a new European-Brazilian relationship, because these are areas where we could generate forms of collaborations, of cooperations, which include certain elements which are essential for the international economy as well. This is define new ways of technology transfer and technology development, and on the other way around to integrate Brazil more in international value and supply chains. We see that this is an element which is gaining importance in the international structures of global and geo-economic relationships. And the Europeans are trying to develop supply chain management with a clear human rights perspective, with a clear social dimension. And this could be an area where a new line of cooperation could be established. There is a specific area which is highly discussed, and I think in the future even more disputed in the international realm. That will be the question of hydrogen. We are seeing a dynamic definition of international hydrogen markets, especially green hydrogen, and the Latin American countries, especially as well, Brazil, are very important actors which could develop a hydrogen partnership with the European Union. And the European Union should prepare for this as well. Up to now, I see not so clear positioning of the European Union, because it in some way is privileging pipeline projects with respect to hydrogen. That means an orientation to the Maghreb area and the Middle East. But I think one of our learnings from the last year has been that we should not develop pipeline dependencies too much, and always be thinking about diversification of our partners all around the world. So I think on hydrogen, we should take first steps in order to advance in the area of the Amazon and the international deforestation policies. Final point, I think if we talk about Brazil and the European Union, we have to talk about the Mercosur agreement. This has a long history of different moments. Now we have a proposal which is in a final situation of negotiation and could in some way enter the ratification processes. I do see high difficulties to reach a ratification process in a very rapid and immediate way, because we have resistances in the European Union which are quite well established in the agricultural sector with respect to environmental mandates, with respect to democracy and civil society rights. And this may imply that we have to reopen the new negotiations, because I imagine as well that the new government in Brazil won't be interested to ratify negotiation which had been finalized by the Bolsonaro government. So although the European institutions up to now have showed the resistance to reopen negotiations, but one will have to find some ways to have additional protocols or other ways in order to give the Mercosur agreement a different point of view in the ratification process. If the resistances in the European Union, due to the fact that it is a mixed agreement and will have to pass through all the national and even in some cases subnational parliaments, then there would be the moment to let behind the interregional approach and establish ways of direct free trade agreements and association agreements, and where Brazil could be the first partner in place. This in some way may correspond to the difficulties that we have seen inside of the Mercosur and the Uruguayan initiatives to celebrate free trade agreements outside of the Mercosur. Final word, our perception in Europe of Brazil has always been that it is a multilateral actor. And what we have seen in the Bolsonaro episode, I hope that will be only an episode, and we will not see a comeback of Bolsonaro, is that multilateralism had been postponed and that Europe didn't find an answer to its proposal and to its interest to find some alliance or coalition of multilateralists in the world. I hope that the Lula government will not goes away to multipolarity as some other great powers are proposing, and will seek to establish new forms of multilateralism, where as well the Europeans have to change their positions, have to adapt and assume major responsibilities, but that will bring us nearer together and permit that we can relaunch our relationship with the new government. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayhold. I will jump and pass the floor immediately to Ambassador Sérgio Amaral, and we can talk after. Please, Ambassador. It is mute, Ambassador. We can't hear you. It's muted.
Well, it's still on mute. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay.
So thank you very much. I am very pleased to participate in the joint initiative of the Europe program with the US program at CEBRI, because we have, first of all, very distinguished participants, and at the same time, we'll be discussing very timely subjects which are in the world agenda now, in the in addition to being in our own agenda nationally, for subjects like democracy, climate, human rights, inequality, which will have a considerable impact on the world as well as in our country. And I would tend to say, although this may seem to be optimistic, that such big dislocations that are taking place in the world agenda bring about positive prospects for Brazil. And I would say that they bring about very important prospects, and in some cases, positive prospects in each one of the three countries or groups considered in this webinar. Let's start with Brazil, in which I think that the election by Lula is a turnaround in Brazil for the two main subjects that are at stake at this moment, which is democracy and climate. What's interesting is that the changes that are taking place in the United States go to the same direction. And I would agree with Tom Shannon that to a certain extent, what's going on in Brazil is a mirror of what has been going on in the United States. And this similarity certainly brings about a positive impact on US-Brazil relations. We have had, for most of the last century, a pendular relations with the United States. Sometimes we are close, sometimes we are distant. But in many cases, our relations have been unpredictable. And I like to quote a former US ambassador who, when he was about to leave Brazil, Ambassador Danilovich, asked that relations between Brazil and the United States are good, but we cannot connect it. Some cases, they are unpredictable. So I hope and believe that the elections that have taken place in Brazil may inaugurate a new period of convergence on basic values. And I think it's very important for us to draw a positive agenda from this convergence on the main issues. And which are these issues? They are democracy, a commitment to democracy against authoritarian populism. This was the case of the United States. This has been the case of Brazil in the recent elections. A commitment to the environment and climate change in both cases. A support for multilateralism, which perhaps is clearer in the case of Brazil, but is also a position by the Biden government. And the commitment to defend social justice. So perhaps we cannot agree on all subjects, and it would be difficult to expect that this would happen. President Sarkozy of France, in a period of difficult relations between France and the United States, said friendship allows for differences. And I think this is an important aspect of our relation with the United States. But whatever we may agree, there is no reason why we cannot work together. And whatever we don't agree, there is no reason why we couldn't talk and negotiate. I think this is a very important and different approach to our bilateral relations, in which differences would bring about a prejudgment on what we can do and what we cannot do. With respect to the European Union, there are also, I think, good perspectives on both the economy and in geopolitical issues. I think that the ratification of the Mercosur-European Union agreement, although it may be difficult, I think that it would be a very serious mistake by the European Union not take the benefit of the opportunities we have now to close this agreement. Because this would bring about very positive developments in trade and investments, and the business community on both sides are eager to overcome the present difficulties and be able to do business together. But what's more important, I think, is the geopolitical impact. Because the Mercosur agreement with the European Union is more than the economy, is more than trade and investment. It is the capacity of Mercosur to expand its presence beyond the Con-Sur, the southern part of the continent, and to join the Alliance for the Pacific, which is a group of countries from the Andean region, and this makes about 8 countries, Mercosur and Alliance for the Pacific together, which represent more than half of the population, of the economy, and of the region of Latin America. And this is extremely important. And if we think that Mercosur and the Alliance for the Pacific can further expand north, we would have the possibility of these agreements being a bridge to the northern part of Brazil, where we have an Amazon Treaty with 10 countries that may bring about a new geopolitical understanding, and more than understanding, agreement that may transform the Amazon as the center of a new geopolitics of the environment and of climate. Perhaps this may seem a fantasy. We have taken so much time discussing Mercosur, and now we do such a jump. But I think that we are in a period of transformation, and we should not think about the next years or the immediate issues. And I think it's time for us to have a wider vision of where Brazil would like to go and how. I'd like to end this presentation but with a caveat. And I think that the welcome to Lula in Europe recently, in Portugal, and I think wherever he will go for this first months, will be very impressive. But we should not take this welcome for granted, or as a waiver to the objective sanctions or measures that are being taken, for instance, by the European Parliament, because they are objective. They imply sanctions for the export of our agricultural goods, which may represent 80% of the exports we may have in this area to the European Union, and they would bring a very difficult barrier to our exports, because it's not only, we are not talking only about products we are talking about the way they are produced. And we are talking about a different kind of assessment by not by exporters, but by importers also, not only by importers, but by exporters also. And this would imply a very difficult way to conduct business with the European Union. I like to finish with a positive note, which is that although there are some signs in the horizon of a de-escalation of the war in Ukraine. I think this has been said by Ukraine that we are entering a new phase. It has been said by Germany that it's enough of this war. This has been said also by US representatives that we are not prepared to continue financing Ukraine. And I think finally, to a certain extent, the vision by Kissinger, which he presented at the last Davos meeting, may be premonitory. And he says, we are entering a new age, a new era. And this new era is different. It's different from what we have in the past. And any kind of arrangement between Ukraine and Russia would not go back to the past, will not go back to where and this configuration existed before. And countries interested, actors in this game, will have to accept changes. I think this is a mention to Ukraine and for its firm position that territories would not be changed. So I think I would have some very short notes on what Tom Shannon mentioned and also about what Gunther mentioned, but I will leave that for the new session we are going to have of question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Amazing talks. I would address several questions, but I need to be pragmatic to manage our time. So we will address very short comments and open provocations or questions. So then I will address his questions as well.
If I have some questions among ourselves. Is that what you mean?
Sorry,
is it
I
the
did not
time for us to discuss shortly about the presentations that were made? Yes.
Yeah. I'm gonna address a very short comment and Demetri, and we'll have the first round so you can interact with each other. If it's that okay for you. Is that okay? Fine. Okay. So very, very, very quickly about some things that came up in this speeches. I would say that we do not have doubts about the performing of the not have doubts about how much Lula will face problems in terms of the governance, the domestic governance, facing the Congress opposition and also the opposition in the streets. But I'm pretty optimistic in terms of how much Lula is able to do about deforestation that can follow, his speech and his performances saying how much Brazil would be this green force. I would like to remember that because I see the environmental agenda for the foreign policy is really credible, and would like to discuss about that. So, because when Lula was elected in 2000 and became president in 2003, the deforestation in Amazon, in illegal Amazon, was very, very high. And throughout the 8 years of Lula's administration, we saw deforestation decreasing almost 70% in 8 years. So I would say Lula has, experience in doing this, and and he has a credible history and past to try to convince European leaders, to believe in his intention to do the same. So I'd like to just to circulate and talk about this. Also, in terms of the Mercosur-EU agreement ratification, and also what Gunther said, I don't know if there is a huge difference between any kind of, trade agreement between European countries and Brazil and the Mercosur-EU agreement, if we consider, the Lula's basis in the society, because he as you know, he made in his campaign, he announced that he would try to renegotiate the agreement because there are sectors of the civil society, Brazilian civil society, that are strongly critical of the terms of the agreement. However, if you do not have the Mercosur-EU agreement ratified, also we will have the same contestation inside the country, and Lula look at the civil society groups a lot. So I see this can be one of the problems that Lula have to face. Let's think very quickly. I like it a lot how Ambassador Shannon said about how much the 21st century will be is to be so different than the 20th century. So in this case, I would like also to remember how much, in European countries, both in European countries and the US, the green transition is very much associated with the digital transition, So how much, European countries and the EU or United States, are able to increase, the bilateral cooperation in terms of technology, because there is no green transition without this kind of advance. And, we have seen this in Europe very well. I would give the floor to Demetrio to address any question or any comment if he wants to. And we can go back to our speakers to interact each other. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. I will be very short and very blunt, because the Lula election is a turnaround in many ways, in many positive ways, but not in a way, in Ukraine way. The Bolsonaro government framed the Brazilian position about Ukraine in a kind of false neutrality. Brazil voted to condemn the invasion of Ukraine, but at the same time, Brazil said no to sanctions against Russia and no to arms deliveries to Ukraine. So, in short, is a pro-Russian neutrality. That was the Bolsonaro position about Ukraine. And unfortunately, the Lula position, we have several indications about that, is exactly the same. Is my guess, but it's everyone's guess, that Lula will maintain the Bolsonaro approach to the conflict in Ukraine. Lula will condemn the invasion, but in practical terms, will condemn arms deliveries to Ukraine and sanctions on Russia. So, this issue touches basic values, the United Nations Charter and the international order. So I would ask to all the three panelists about this issue. What about the Brazil relationship with the United States, with the European Union, when Lula government maintains and insists in this Bolsonaro approach to the Ukrainian conflict?
Yeah, please, the word is with you. Who would like to start?
I'm happy to start.
Thank you.
First of all, I just want to congratulate Gunther and Sergio for excellent presentations. Very rich in ideas, and the possibility to continue this discussion is going to last much longer than this show itself. But to the issues that have been raised, to the questions that have been raised, I think Demetrio hits an important point here, which is how Brazil chooses to present itself to the world in relationship to Ukraine and Russia. First of all, the condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is important. There has to be a clear understanding that what Russia did was an act of naked aggression that's not justified in any other term except for naked aggression, and that it poses significant challenges to international law and order that have to be understood and addressed. So that's important. But it would be a mistake to pretend that you can remain neutral in this kind of dispute. I think Gunther has highlighted the fact that the global South has sought a way to not get drawn into what they consider to be a European war. But the United States and NATO have made it clear that this is more than a European war. And that this is having a profound impact on global structures. The most recent G20 meeting was a clear representation of that. But the fact that Russian diplomats are largely being driven from the field in multilateral organizations and have great difficulty getting elected to such bodies highlights the larger impact that Russia's behavior has had. And, we can all have differences about sanctions, especially sanctions that are not authorized by the United Nations. But I would argue that Brazil can play a very important role in addressing the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, especially in regard to global food security and global energy security. And this is where Brazil can make clear that that it recognizes that Russia's behavior has had a profoundly disruptive impact in those areas, and that Brazil can play a role both diplomatically, but also in terms of its production of energy and its production of food to address the consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But let's not make no mistake about this. With Finland and Sweden joining NATO, that leaves Ukraine as the only Central European country not that part of NATO. And with Russia sitting in control of about 1/5 of that country, the argument to include Ukraine into NATO is going to be strong and almost irresistible. And so at least in Central Europe, we are looking at as Gunther said, a geopolitical moment that's going to redefine how Europe relates to the Russian Federation and beyond. And that's a fact that is larger than Europe. That's a fact that's going to reverberate through the world.
Maybe I continue.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. In some way, the ambassador mentioned a point which I think is essential for our understanding of one another. I'm not so sure that we will see an end of the Ukraine war coming soon. It will last, it will continue, and it will in some way pose new challenges to the US government, which had in some way mentioned that the central scenario of the global conflict would be the Indo-Pacific area, and suddenly it's Europe again. And this will mean that the Europeans will have to assume a highly larger part in the defense of liberty in Europe and in helping the Ukraine survive the continuous attacks from Russia. And in some way, this focal point in the European policy process implies that certain parts of the world do disappear from the agenda. This is especially true for Africa, where we see quite clear how the African governments are very insecure what the European position and the compromises it had assumed with the region will continue. And in some way, it may be as well a reflection to the relationship with Latin America. Up to now, we had only a minister of cooperation from Germany who since the new government, did a trip to Latin America. So it's really a point of view that we have to be clear that in the attention agenda, this will have effects and it will change the configuration of a lot of policy areas, where there will be forms of cooperation by coalition of the willing, flexible geometry, and all kind of forum shopping that will happen in order to maintain some sort of global interaction, excluding in some way Russia and its allied powers. So I think we have to be prepared that the global order or the different partial orders of the global order will change, that we will see a situation of blockades in a lot of international organizations, and that we will need informal ways to manage global problems if we won't agree that the coming years will be lost in terms of management of challenges at the global order. Thank you.
I'd like to just address Demetrius' question, which raised the comments by Tom Shannon and Gunther. I believe, and I'm confident, that relations between Brazil and the United States will improve considerably on our bilateral agenda, not necessarily in our multilateral agenda, because sometimes our interests may differ. And I think one of them is the point that Demetrius raised on our position vis-a-vis Russia or Russia invasion, and also the present situation in Ukraine. I think this will have to have further consideration by our foreign affairs minister whenever the new government arrives, because there are inconsistencies, I agree, but I can't see any way out of this for the time being.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have received a few questions from the audience, so I'll try to address. I guess I need my glasses too. Okay. The first question is I'm gonna read three or four questions maybe, and we can make a second round and see if you have time for more. Okay. So first question, do not have the name of the person, but the question is, will diplomacy and fiscal matters play a secondary role in the confirmation of national interests, a strong economy for that matter? What is the place for soft power instruments, especially in regards to those nations that engage in territorial warfare and various human rights violations? The second question came from Adriano Fonseca. He asked, why not invest massively in the crossing of Mercosur water curtains, so towards the Pacific and into a new end of history for the humanity, based and powered by clean energies for world peace? Yeah, the third question is from Balak Jensen Joseph, and he asks, can you comment on the role of influence of the congresses and or parliaments of the US, Brazil, and in Europe in the strengthening of the trilateral relationship, particularly considering that there are lingering political polarizations in Brazil's civil society and elsewhere. So I would like to pass the floor to our speeches. Would you like to comment, to answer these questions, please?
Yes, I would like, and I take this opportunity to comment one very important comment made by Tom Shannon. I think he raised something which normally we don't realize, which is the role of soft power in our emergence in world affairs. And I think this is right. And I think this is something will continue to exist. First of all, because we are not concerned about building up a military power. The power in our minds is basically, at least, economic power, and other forms of soft power. And I think this is very positive. As to contested conflicts, I think that Brazil will not change our position very much, which in most cases is pegged to our traditional United Nations approach and regulations. And I think that what the challenge for us, I think, is to well understand what's going on around the world, because we tend to lag behind. And this is my basic concern with respect to the foreign policy of the new government, because we may have the eyes on the past and not be concerned enough on building the future. And this would be really a mistake, and not only a mistake. This would jeopardize many of Brazilian interests. And I give you an example with respect to UNASUR and with respect to CELAC, which were already mentioned. I have nothing against these two institutions, except for the fact that they are outdated. They are an anachronism. They are something that comes from the past. And there are many other things that we are discussing today here that would deserve more attention to this. And the same applies to what Gunther mentioned. And I was very, very, very much surprised with his mention of something that I didn't think about being part of our agenda, which is the BRICS. The BRICS may be important, but the BRICS to a certain extent are also something which comes from the past, from a period of Cold War. I think that the BRICS are positive, but it should be reformed in order to be able to cope with more urgent challenges that we'll face in the near future. As to the question which was made to Ana Paula, I think that there is something which is very interesting, which is the idea of expansion of the Alliance for the Pacific, which I'm totally in favor of, and which would enlarge our diplomatic agenda and also our expansion towards a new area which has never been the focus in our discussion on foreign policy, which is the Amazon region. The Amazon region, the northern countries, and the northern states of Brazil. If we are to really pay attention to the Amazon region, to deforestation, and to a new geopolitics of the environment, we really have to approach these issues, which would be a bridge not only to the southern parts of Brazil, but to the northern countries. And in addition to that, there's much we can do with the United States, and already are doing with the Smithsonian institutions, and with the European Union in the area biodiversity, that would really deserve being a central part of our policy or diplomatic agenda in the next future.
Thank you, Ambassador. Anyone want to make a comment? I do have one question more, but I don't know if you have time for that. What should they do?
I'm happy to make a couple of very quick comments. First of all, I think the questions were excellent. I think Sergio noted in regard to the first one about soft power and diplomacy and the impact of the economy in shaping national interests. I really think this is going to define in many ways the success in the 21st century. If Iraq and Afghanistan have taught the United States anything, and if Ukraine has taught Russia anything, it's that military might and prowess is not enough to win. In fact, it might actually inhibit winning over time because it misrepresents what power and influence ultimately are. Because if you want to influence people, if you want to be able to direct people, if you want to be able to build alliances and partnerships, you have to move beyond threat, and you have to move beyond violence. You have to be able to show that your economy, your diplomacy, your national purpose is relevant to other people. And if it's not relevant to other people, they will not participate with you. And what's been striking about Ukraine is that even though the Ukrainians, through their courage, have shown that the Russian military is not what people thought it was, the fact of the matter is that Ukraine is prevailing up to this point, not only because of their courage, but because of the support they have received from NATO and the weaponry they have received and the huge inpouring of wealth. But what they have showed clearly is that military or attempts at military conquest that cannot produce political submission will not be successful. And the Ukrainians have made clear that they will not submit to the Russians under any circumstances. So Russia has lost in that sense. But this is where soft power and economies become so important, because as we look deeper into the 21st century, it's evident to me that that economic growth, social opening is really what's going to define success. And this is where I think the European Union, Brazil, and the United States can play a very important role, because we have a way of articulating this and making clear that this has to be the basis and the foundation. And then very shortly, in regard to the role of Congresses and parliaments, they're going to play a very important role. Because if you look closely at what's happening in the United States and Brazil, the presidencies of both countries are under assault by legislatures, as legislatures assert authorities that historically they've had, but which have been overwhelmed by executive kind of accumulation of power. And so we are increasingly in a moment in which there's real tension between Congresses and presidents. It's a little bit different in parliamentary systems because of the nature of parliaments. But how these Congresses end up relating to each other, how they relate to parliaments, how they relate to the European Parliament and individual legislatures in Europe is going to be kind of a second tier level of diplomacy, but a very important one.
Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Maybe I can comment on the issues of economy. I think we are in a situation where what we are seeing now, from the point of view of a large part of analysts in Europe, with respect to Russia, may become some sort of a blueprint with China. And this is a very crucial point that will as well be relevant for Brazil and other countries of the Global South, because there is a perception in Europe that China has been violating systematically the WTO regulations, that it is assuming a policy of global expansion, not in a militaristic way, but in an economic and social way. And we are discussing here quite clearly how we have to refurbish global supply chains, which are passing to 50–60% through China. And we are looking around for diversifying these partners in the global supply chains. And in that way, it is important to be clear that the supply chains, which are the structure of the globalization, are now in transformation and will change as well the importance and the role that certain countries can play. If you look to the discussions on friendshoring, this is a clear sign that this economic instrument will be under siege and will be element of a changed way of considering globalization and global partners. In this way, it's important to be clear that soft power elements are essential, but that in a growing way, hard power dimensions will be present in the reconfiguration of trade relations, will be present in the discussion where the access to strategic resources will be in commodities, will be distributed around the world. That's not a very pleasant way to think about it, but I'm afraid that we are going in this direction, and we have all to be prepared that this is changing as well our bilateral relationships.
Well, it's not a surprise, so much to talk, but we will not have time, unfortunately, to address more questions. So immediately, I think I have to pass the floor, to give the floor to Ronaldo for the final remarks. And I'm sorry for those that sent questions and we could not address to our speakers, but it's a good sign because maybe we can do a second, webinar. We will have a lot to talk about the issue of today. So thank you so much. Thank you for the for the honor of having, you with us. So Ronaldo, the floor is yours for the closing words. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ana Paula. I am very enthusiastic about this event. I want to thank our speakers for wonderful presentations. I think we all have learned a lot from what you had to say. And as I think Tom Shannon alluded to, perhaps this should be the first of a few other events along these lines, because the world is changing very quickly. Events happen faster than we can digest them. And I think we should plan in a few months' time another round of discussions, because I'm sure there will be new events and new situations in the world. And I hope we can count with your cooperation, because I think it was a fantastic way to end our program, both for the Europe program and the US program, in such a high note. So thank you very much for your cooperation. I know that you are extremely busy, that you have many other important commitments, and I'm very thankful on behalf of CEBRI for the use of your time. So thank you very much. I wish you a very happy new year if we don't see each other before then, and look forward to seeing you in another occasion. Thank you very much.